Redeemers. Gradually, Democrats regained control of the state governments in the South. In each state, they moved quickly to get rid of Reconstruction reforms. Democrats who brought their party back to power in the South were called Redeemers. They came from a variety of backgrounds. For instance, U.S. Senator John T. Morgan of Alabama was a former general in the Confederate Army. Newspaper editor Henry Grady of Georgia was interested in promoting Southern industry. Redeemers wanted to reduce the size of state government and limit the rights of African Americans. They lowered state budgets and got rid of a variety of social programs. The Redeemers cut property taxes and cut public funding for schools. They also succeeded in limiting African American civil rights. African Americans' rights restricted. Redeemers set up the poll tax. In an effort to deny the vote to African Americans, the poll tax was a special tax people had to pay before they could vote. Some states also targeted African American voters by requiring them to pass a literacy test. A so-called grandfather clause written into law affected men whose fathers or grandfathers could vote before 1867. In those cases, a voter did not have to pay a poll tax or pass a literacy test. As a result, almost every white man could escape the voting restrictions. Redeemer governments also introduced legal segregation, the forced separation of whites and African Americans in public places. Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation became common in southern states in the 1880s. African Americans challenged Jim Crow laws in court. In 1883, however, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. The court also ruled that the 14th Amendment applied only to the actions of state governments. This ruling allowed private individuals and businesses to practice segregation. Here is a picture. Jim Crow laws. This 1913 illustration shows the segregation of society caused by Jim Crow laws. After Reconstruction ended, the U.S. court system upheld legalized segregation for nearly 80 years. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally put an end to all state and local laws requiring segregation. Pleggy versus Ferguson. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court returned to the issue of segregation. When Homer Plessy, an African American, refused to leave the whites-only Louisiana train car he was riding on, he was arrested and accused of breaking Louisiana's Separate Car Act of 1890. This Jim Crow law stated that all railway companies carrying passengers in their coaches in this state shall provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races by providing 2 or more passenger coaches for each passenger train, or by dividing the passenger coaches by a partition so as to secure separate accommodations. This was the Separate Car Act of 1890, Louisiana state law. Plessy sued the railroad company and lost. His lawyers argued that the law violated the right to equal treatment under the 14th Amendment. He then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against Plessy in Plessy v. Ferguson. Segregation was allowed, said the court. If separate but equal facilities were provided. Among the justices, only John Marshall Harlan disagreed with the court's decision. Segregation became widespread across the country. African Americans were forced to use separate public schools, libraries, and parks. When they existed, these facilities were usually of poorer quality than those created for whites. In practice, these so-called separate but equal facilities were separate and unequal. Neither Congress nor the President would make significant actions to overturn the doctrine until the 1900s. Farming in the South. Few African Americans in the South could afford to buy or even rent farms. Many African Americans therefore remained on plantations. Others tried to make a living in the cities. African Americans who stayed on plantations often became a part of a system known as sharecropping, or sharing the crop. Landowners provided the land, tools, and supplies, and sharecroppers provided the labor. At harvest time, the sharecropper usually had to give most of the crop to the landowner. Whatever remained belonged to the sharecropper. In theory, croppers who saved a little might even rent land for cash and keep their full harvest in a system known as tent farming. Instead, most sharecroppers lived in a cycle of debt. When they needed food, clothing, and supplies, most families had to buy goods on credit because they had little cash. When sharecroppers sold their crops, they hoped to be able to pay off these debts. However, bad weather, poor harvest, or low crop prices often made this dream impossible. Sharecroppers usually grew cotton, one of the South's most important cash crops. When too many farmers planted cotton, however, the supply became excessive. As a result, the price per bale of cotton dropped. Many farmers understood the drawbacks of planting cotton. However, farmers felt pressured from banks and others to keep raising cotton. Rebuilding Southern industry. The Southern economy suffered through cycles of good and bad years. As cotton prices went up and down, some business leaders hoped industries would strengthen the Southern economy and create a new South. Southern industry. Henry Grady, an Atlanta newspaper editor, was a leader of the New South movement. Grady and his supporters felt that with its cheap and abundant labor, the South could build factories and provide a workforce for them. The most successful industrial development in the South involved textile production. Business people built textile mills in many small towns to produce cotton fabric. Many people from rural areas came to work in the mills, but African Americans were not allowed to work in most of them. Southern mill life. Work at the cotton mills appealed to farm families who had trouble making ends meet. Recruiters sent out by the mills promised a good wage and steady work. Mills employed large numbers of women and children. Women did most of the spinning and were value workers. However, few women had the opportunity to advance within the company. Okay, so here is a picture. In this picture, what you see is the New South. Atlanta rebuilt quickly after the war, becoming a leading railroad and industrial center. Newspaper editor Henry Grady gave stirring speeches about the need for industry in the South. He became one of the best-known spokesmen of the New South. So one of the things he says is, the New South is stirred with the breath of a new life. And there is Henry Grady. Many mill workers were proud of the skill they used, but they did not enjoy their work. Workers often labored 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Cotton dust and lint filled the air, causing asthma and an illness known as brown lung disease. Fast-moving machinery caused injuries and even deaths. Despite the long hours and dangerous work conditions, wages remained low. However, mill work did offer an alternative to farming. Reconstruction in the North. Although most federal Reconstruction policies were designed to reform the South, they affected groups in the North as well. There were many groups that worked to advance their own rights and interests during this time. Women and Northern African Americans. The radical Republicans passed many federal laws that required Southern states to allow African American men to vote. They based their cause on the ideal of equality found in the Declaration of Independence and Reconstruction. Women's suffragists began using these same arguments to support their own suffrage. Wyoming and Utah granted women the vote in 1869, but their motivations were not just to ensure equal rights for women. Wyoming leaders hoped to attract more women residents, while Utahns hoped to counteract the rising number of non-Mormon voters. Okay, and here we go. Here's the last page. African Americans in the North faced less social discrimination than they did in the South, but still faced racism and segregation. In response, some state governments passed laws that made segregation illegal. Some integrated their school systems. Most states upheld the principle of separate but equal facilities. A changing economy. During the War of Reconstruction, the economy of the North and the West grew rapidly. Manufacturing, commerce, and rail transportation generated tremendous fortunes. Large companies grew by buying smaller companies, and railroads made huge profits transporting goods and people. Tax revenue increased as well, and governments were able to provide more services and more investments. Between 1865 and 1873, more than 2 million immigrants arrived in the United States. They provided a new pool of labor for the growing industrial economy. The number of labor unions increased, and they began to push for policies that protected workers. Reformers pressed for 8-hour workdays and fair pay laws. In addition, the increase in commercial and trading business led to a shift in the makeup of the working class. It now included a majority of professionals and white-collar workers. Eventually, the focus of the Republican Party began to move away from civil rights for African Americans and towards reducing government corruption. The acceptance of the Compromise of 1877 signaled the end of the Republican focus on the remaining racial politics in the South. In this lesson, you learned about the end of Reconstruction. In the years that followed, the South continued to rebuild, but the gains made by the African Americans were reversed.